All right, having concluded my lecture, I would now like to deal with some questions that were directed to me after the lecture. Now, as it was distinctly understood that my lecture was not to be a theological treatment of the subject, but a philosophical or rational one, no argument or proof could be drawn from revelation or from the Christian sentiment. I did that very deliberately. Consequently, the questions put and the answers given will be set down here with the same restriction, and the various points treated impartially from a purely rational standpoint or a purely philosophical or you might say conceptual standpoint, or from the standpoint of conceptual analysis. Okay, first question. What proof have you that the Christian idea of immortality is more scientific than that of others? And also, follow-up question, is not the discussion about immortality purely a matter of speculation, as there are so many conceptions of it differing one from the other and each equally valid? Okay, well, in response, I would say the term immortality, as used throughout my lecture, was defined as meaning the permanence of existence and identity of the immortal being. My task was this, and no more, to prove basically that the human soul was a being of such a nature as required us to assent to the fact that it does not cease to exist at death, but persists as a living being, that is, a being capable of exercising vital action. In the case of the separated soul, such action consists of intellection and is immanent. Again, those of you that have heard this lecture, this might be redundant, but it doesn't hurt to be emphatic about these notions and these concepts. Moving on. The Christian idea of immortality, as the questioner means it to be taken, seems to be the foregoing plus all that Revelation gives us as to the states of souls after death. Further than the bare conclusion of rewards and punishments in a future life, philosophy cannot take us. But there is nothing in the Christian presentation of the doctrine that is inherently contradictory or even improbable. As to the many conceptions, as it was put, of immortality, well, of course, if I'm trying to demonstrate the truth of one, while my audience persistently lays hold of another, we are confronted at the outset with an impasse, possibly. And for that reason, I was at pains to make my meaning clear by a definition, and I attempt to prove no more nor less than is contained in it. Right, next question. Do you believe that consciousness continues after death, or are the whole component parts of man essential to consciousness? Follow-up question 1. When it's known that consciousness depends entirely on the state of the brain, are we not warranted in dispensing with the hypothesis of a soul? Follow-up question 2. To exercise its functions, the soul requires the cooperation of the body, but at death, the body perishes. Therefore, the soul, unable to operate, must consequently also perish. To say that the soul possesses two methods of action, one with the body and the other without the body, seems to beg the question at issue. And final follow-up question. As we have not in our experience known consciousness to exist apart from matter, how do we know that what people call the soul can exist apart from matter? Okay, in response, if, as has been demonstrated, or so I would argue, that the soul exists after death, well, then it must also be conscious after death. We must have some kind of consciousness, personal awareness. Otherwise, you risk some kind of pantheistic notion of an impersonal absorption into the pervasive divine consciousness of reality, or however it might define pantheistically speaking. Now, its understanding, the way I'm defining it, the soul's understanding is its life. In its act of understanding, even in its state of union with the body, of which it is the actuating principle, it's been shown that it acts immaterially and consequently without any direct dependence upon the body. Now, this notion of consciousness depending on the brain, or thought is a function of the brain, this is a shibboleth of modern scientists. In the first place, then the nature of understanding is such that it is impossible that it should proceed from a material organ. Understanding, thought, reasoning are immaterial actions, or else there is no such thing as understanding, thought, or reasoning at all. There really is no other alternative. Think about what's being stated there. Thought is a function of the brain. Consciousness depends on the brain. Now, if that's really true, how do you know that that's true? If your thought were just a mere function of your brain, that means that your brain is squirting out the chemical known as thought. And secondly, that your brain is sorting out another chemical, namely that thought is a function of the brain. All of these propositions or statements, or however you wish to define them, is that also a function of the brain? That's another problem we have to encounter. In other words, this notion really reduces to a kind of philosophical and logical absurdity. If thought is a function of the brain, you really shouldn't be able to know that thought is a function of the brain. And if I disagree that thought is a function of the brain, which I do, then my brain just happens to be squirting out different chemicals leading to different conclusions than the chemicals in your brain that are squirting out information. So how do we differentiate between the two unless there is some kind of transcendent principle or reality by which we can judge and differentiate between the two competing notions? So, as I said, understanding and thought and reasoning are immaterial actions. There really is, like I said, if there is any other alternative, I would like to hear it. We can debate it. Now, it follows that the statement consciousness depends on the brain is, as it stands, not only gratuitous, but also untrue, unless the words depends and function are understood in a sense other than that in which they are employed by the objectors. One ought not, in a serious inquiry into a question such as that of immortality, to scant possible explanations. And it must not be forgotten that we employ the word function and the word depends in different ways. There is a productive function, certainly, as when we say motion is a function of the locomotive. But that is not exhausting the subject. We have to remember that. It's not exhaustive. There are also what we would call realizing functions, as in the trigger of a gun. There are transmissive functions, as in a pane of glass, and a concomitant or varying function, as in an induction coil. That changes take place in the material structure of the brain when we think, that our thoughts are in some way dependent upon the healthy and normal working of the organ, need not be and is not denied. The brain definitely is essential for the intellect, for the understanding and reason. All of these immaterial notions that I've mentioned, in order for them to come to knowledge of material reality, they need a material organ. The brain is that. If this material organ deteriorates or malfunctions, then it will prevent the intellect and other faculties of the mind to operate in a normal and efficient manner. So again, to repeat, that our thoughts are in some way dependent upon the brain is not denied. But the question is, in what way is it dependent? Would it be an extrinsic or an intrinsic dependency, or an extrinsic or an intrinsic relationship? So essentially, yes, we can agree that our thoughts are in some way dependent upon the normal working of the brain. We need not deny that. But it in no way follows, and this is what needs to be remembered, that there's no kind of necessary entailment. It in no way follows that a condition sine qua non of thought is a cause of it. In other words, the condition does not entail causation, or that it is the direct effect of a material process. Rather, even were we, which we are not, led to suppose that thought was a secretion of the brain cells because of physical or physiological observations, the fact that the nature of thought or understanding or consciousness is absolutely incompatible with the nature of matter would impel us to assert that consciousness and thought were not and could not be dependent entirely upon the brain or its states. Now, moving on. In its present state of union, the soul, or intellect, just to deal with at least one faculty of the soul, requires the cooperation of the body. I think I've made that abundantly clear. And this is a scholastic notion. This is an Aristotelian notion. This is a legitimate notion. It can be demonstrated through reason. One of the principal points I made in my lecture was that the soul was the formal principle of the human body. This is also basically an Aristotelian notion. Then a closer union can scarcely be conceived, really, so much so that from the union results one substantial being. The body and soul are not composed as two entities. We don't have a kind of Cartesian dualism taking place here, or Platonic dualism. But when we assert that man understands, thinks, reasons, is conscious, wills, if you please, we assert actions that are immaterial, indivisible, and unextended. Hence, we are forced by the necessities of our rational nature to admit that the formal principle which informs matter so as to make man gives him existence, life, sensation, feeling, and something more, something additional. Now, that something more or something additional is the fulcrum on which the question of immortality turns. The soul transforming matter may be likened to a swimmer in water, yet not totally immersed, for it has an action of its own, independently of the body. And on the nature of that action, carefully examined, analyzed, and tested, the immateriality of the faculty and its consequent immortality is necessarily inferred. Now, though we may have no experience of consciousness manifested apart from matter, we certainly have an experience of matter apart from thought and consciousness. Hence, consciousness is not a characteristic of matter, at least not necessarily so. If you were going to try to prove some kind of necessary logical relationship between consciousness and matter, then that would have to be demonstrated. It's yet to be demonstrated, and even scientists who try to say that it's been demonstrated never really prove it from a necessarily logical entailment. We may have no experimental knowledge of soul apart from body, though by the analysis pursued in the process of this lecture, it was shown that intelligence was an action intrinsically independent, and that therefore the soul was itself independent of matter. But on the other hand, we have experimental knowledge of the dead body without the soul. We therefore know that what people call the soul is not the necessary product of an organic body, that it can exist, as it now can operate, as a complete substantial entity in itself. Okay, there were some other questions that came forward having to do with the soul's pre-existence. So let me deal with those questions as well. A couple of examples. If the soul is immortal, did it not exist before our birth? Another one, by the term immortality, do you mean that the soul has always existed, or that its existence begins at birth and continues onwards? In response, I would say the opinion of Pythagoras, Plato, and Origen, and I may add Descartes, that all human souls were created at the beginning of the world has nothing to be urged in its support. On the contrary, the soul is by its nature the formal principle of an individual man. It is therefore against its nature to be created separate from the body which it informs. Souls, having existed for so long a time, ought to possess intellectual conceptions, but we are born with no knowledge, and only gradually and with great labor arrive at a knowledge of a few truths. Those who wish to read more about this can read, for example, the Phaedo of Plato, where there's actually an argument that Socrates, as the mouthpiece of Plato, uses called the argument from recollection, and it basically presupposes this notion of pre-existence of the soul. The next, I would say, memory is intellectual as well as sensible. We have no memory of a previous existence, so what reason do we have to believe in such a notion? Moreover, metempsychosis, or reincarnation, or the transmigration of souls, is impossible because the formal principle which united to matter makes man cannot, united to other matter, make anything else than man. Because the same formal principle, which is individuated by the body to which it is united, and consequently is this form numerically only because of that matter, cannot be numerically 2 or 3 by renewed individuations in other matter. And if the transmigration of souls is impossible on these grounds, the soul created before its union with the body would exist in an unnatural state, as it indeed does after its separation from the body at death. It follows, therefore, that the existence of the soul, the formal principle in man, begins at that instant when the human fetus can be said to be man, and continues onwards, spiritual, immaterial, and therefore immortal. The next question reads as follows. In what way do you reconcile transformation with decay? I would answer that transformation is both generation and corruption. In the case of the chemical example, water corrupts when hydrogen and oxygen are generated, and vice versa. Decay, in other words, is merely the change or transformation viewed from the standpoint of the thing that ceases to be. Viewed from the standpoint of the thing that comes into being, that same transformation is generation. Next question. Is it not the case that evolution shows that the soul is merely a progressive development of mind, which can clearly be traced by examination of the different species? I respond by saying that the hypothesis of evolution can show nothing of the kind. It's an assumption, really, and a gratuitous one at that, to assert that evolution has shown anything of the kind. I do not wish to be flippant, and I speak with all respect of what science has done for the comfort and well-being of the human race, but I must protest, and that strongly, against this blessed word evolution being brought in like a conjuring trick as an explanation for every mystery under the sun. Call it a theory, if you will, whatever you wish to call it, but materialistic evolution has not yet been proved, and until it is proved, I decline to accept it as trustworthy. There are, apart from the extraordinary lack of evidence in its support, the gravest of philosophical objections to be urged against it. And really, if you look at it from a very critically minded perspective, you'll find that the whole notion of evolution existed as a philosophy long before Darwin wrote his Origin of Species. 99 out of the 100 who have it so glibly upon their lips do not really grasp the extent of the philosophical and scientific issues at stake. The 100th, you could say, suspends his judgment. Do you realize what it means to take away the specific distinctions in say, the animal kingdom? Well, what then becomes of biology? Are we to go back in the 20th century to the stuttering philosophy of Heraclitus? The extent to which these assumptions lead to absurdity is just, the number is elephantine. Okay, next question. If the idea of annihilation seems to make God a monster, does not the idea that any of his creatures are destined to eternal torments much more convey the same idea? And other questions followed along the same lines. Why eternal punishment for the temporary offenses of so frail a creature as man? And I would deal with these by saying that the questions are really beside the point and an occasion of the lecture that I presented. If the soul is proved to be immortal by the strict processes of reason, add to this right and wrong, freely willed and freely committed, and just draw the conclusions rationally. Now, the first question argues from annihilation to punishment. Granted that man is free and that God is infinite, and that the immortal soul freely chooses evil instead of good, it would appear, firstly, that were there not eternal punishment, the infinity of God would be impugned. And second, that did eternal punishment convey the same idea as that of annihilation, the freedom of man's will would be arbitrarily and unwarrantably contrasted with the necessary findings of his reason. And thirdly, that either the infinite goodness of God in himself and his justice would be denied, or else the responsibility of the soul would be minimized. I may add further that Catholic theology, as well as sound common sense, is very precise as to its definition of what constitutes an offense which will be punished with eternal torments. Again, this is altogether beyond the scope of the lecture, but the questions seem to necessitate it, and so I deal with them. Such an offense must be committed with the knowledge of the gravity of the act, with a sense of obligation to perform or omit it, which implies at least, as its ultimate reason, the infinite majesty of God, and with the free will, notwithstanding this, to commit it. That is just common sense and theology. And when this point is understood aright, I think most of the difficulties vanish. To our minds, the theory of the lost soul being annihilated may appear more merciful, but is that really true? Of course, God could, if he wished, annihilate any soul. Does he? Well, in the light of what immediately precedes, would it be consonant with his infinite majesty and justice to annihilate a soul? Well, God does not create a soul so to oppose his will that it would thereby live forever in misery. He creates it to be saved. He creates it with a free will and with all the limitations implied by its nature. If it is damned by its own free will. Could, I ask you, God create a creature with a will that is free and capable of offending him? Is not that a contradiction in terms? And if it be urged, why did God create at all a creature that might suffer eternally? Well, I answer that if he created a being with freedom of will, he could not do otherwise. Why then did he create? Because he foresaw that his creature, having free will, if it were lost, would lose itself freely with an entire personal responsibility. But he created it to be saved, and not to be lost. But he created it with freedom of will, and this must be read in the light of the answer to the immediately preceding question. Now, in answer to the question, why eternal punishment for the temporary offenses of so frail a creature as man? Well, because the nature of God is infinite, and infinity corresponds to eternity. We may be confident that eternal punishment will not follow any sins except those which have a relationship to the infinity of God, and are committed with such a knowledge of the offense as is sufficient to draw down upon it condign punishment. To understand the question and its answer, not only the immortality of the soul, but also the existence and infinity of the Creator, the nature and unreasonableness of sin, the freedom of the will, all must be taken into account. Before these three demonstrable truths, the difficulties really vanish into thin air. And even if difficulties remained unsolved, the demonstrative proof of the immortality of the human soul remains untouched, with its conclusion that whatever further problems may be raised, the soul of man is immortal and will persist in being after the dissolution of the individual which takes place in corporeal death. Thus ends the question and answer portion of the lecture. Thank you for listening.